Welcome to Nightmare Files, where real horror and chilling mysteries come to life. From eerie footage to unsettling stories, prepare for nightmares you won't forget. Hey everyone, if you're a fan of horror stories, unsettling mysteries, and spine-chilling encounters, then you've come to the right place. Don't forget to like this video so YouTube knows you love horror content. Comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced something eerie in the woods? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a terrifying new story. Tonight's story takes you on a journey that no one should ever take. What was meant to be a peaceful solo hiking trip quickly turns into something far more sinister. Something is watching him. Something is whispering from the darkness. And deep in the forest, there's a door that leads nowhere. And the worst part? He never truly left. Will you dare follow him into the haunted wilderness? If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's begin the story. Welcome to the Whispers in the Deep Woods. On Fire.
There are some memories you can never escape. Not because they were the happiest or most meaningful moments of your life, but because they left a mark so deep that you could never truly be the same again. For me, that memory is from the fall of 1998. That was the last time I ever went hiking. That was the last time I ever felt safe in the woods. It started with an innocent idea, a spur-of-the-moment decision born from frustration and exhaustion. I had a long weekend ahead of me, and I hadn't taken any time for myself in months. A solo hiking trip seemed like the perfect escape. Fresh air, solitude, and the comforting silence of the wilderness. That was all I needed. My plan was simple. Drive to Echo Ridge, an isolated mountain trail deep in the northern Cascades. Spend 3 days hiking, camp under the stars, and return home feeling renewed. That was the plan, at least. I packed light, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a flashlight, and some bottled water. The Echo Ridge Trail wasn't far from the more popular routes, but it was remote enough that it never saw much foot traffic. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive up was peaceful, just me and my old truck bouncing along the dirt roads, surrounded by towering pines stretching like green spires into the sky. The kind of beauty that makes you forget about the world outside. I reached the trailhead around noon. The place was completely deserted, as I had expected. Perfect. I parked my truck, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and set off. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful, exactly the way I wanted them to be. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs, making me feel invincible, like I could walk forever. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirp of a bird. Then, about 4 hours in, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. I wasn't expecting to see a car. Yet, there it was. An old, rusted sedan, half buried in the undergrowth just off the side of the trail. It had clearly been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. The metal was corroded, the windows shattered, and the tires had long since deflated, leaving it to sink into the earth. I stepped closer, drawn in by sheer curiosity. There were no roads nearby. No visible trails wide enough for a car to have made it this far. It didn't make sense. The doors were locked, but when I peered through the cracked driver's side window, I saw something that made my skin crawl. Scattered across the seats and floor were old, yellowed papers, handwritten notes as far as I could tell. Most of the ink had faded, but I could still make out fragments of words scratched in desperate, uneven script. Watching me, not alone, never leaves. That was enough for me. My stomach tightened with unease, but I shook it off. People abandon things in the woods all the time. Maybe a stranded traveler had used the car for shelter once, or maybe someone had driven it off-road decades ago and left it behind. I took a final glance at the eerie sight before moving on. The sun was starting to set by the time I found a decent spot to make camp, a small clearing near a quiet creek. It was the kind of place I had always loved, untouched by people, where the only sounds were the gentle rush of water and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Yet, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but as I finished setting up my tent and sat down to eat, I realized what was wrong. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of branches in the breeze. It was as if everything was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the stillness weighed on me. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that the woods were never truly silent, not unless something had disturbed them. Still, I forced myself to ignore the growing unease and crawled into my tent. I zipped up the entrance, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and let the exhaustion of the day take over. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Half asleep, I listened, waiting for the usual sounds of the forest to return. But as my mind cleared, I realized this wasn't random noise. It was low, rhythmic murmuring, somewhere between speech and a hum. And it was close. I lay there, motionless, my breath shallow. My rational brain told me I was imagining things, that it was just the creek or the wind shifting through the trees. But my instincts, the part of me that had never steered me wrong before, told me something else. I wasn't alone. I clenched my fists, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to look, to unzip my tent just enough to peek outside, but a deep, primal part of me refused. So I stayed still and listened. The whispering didn't stop. It wasn't loud, not enough to be distinct, but it was there, just beyond my tent. Low, steady, unnatural. I forced myself to take slow, shallow breaths, hoping that if I stayed quiet, whatever was out there would lose interest. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then the sound changed. Instead of whispering, it became movement, a soft shuffling through the leaves. Deliberate, slow. Someone was walking outside my tent. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to stay absolutely still. It moved in circles, the sound growing louder, then softer, then louder again, like it was pacing, deciding something. I gripped my flashlight. The temptation to turn it on was overwhelming. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a deer or some stray hiker who had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps were too controlled, not the hesitant, random movements of an animal. And there was something off about them. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. I held my breath. The air inside felt thick, like the whole forest was waiting. I listened, strained my ears, tried to hear if there was breathing, anything. Silence. I told myself to wait, to give it time, to let whatever was out there move on. And then Something pressed against the fabric of my tent. Not a person's hand, not an animal's snout. Something elongated, too long, too thin. It pressed, dragged, making a slow curling motion across the nylon. I bit down on my lip, clamping a hand over my mouth to stop the involuntary noise rising in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound at all. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like forever. I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to check. I don't remember falling asleep. Maybe my body shut down from exhaustion. Maybe I passed out from holding my breath too long. But when I woke, the sun was up, and the world was normal again. Almost, because when I unzipped my tent and crawled outside, I saw the footprints. Not mine, and not like anything I'd ever seen before. The footprints weren't human. They were long, narrow, and deep, pressed into the damp earth like something heavy had stood there. The spacing between each step was too far apart for a normal person's stride, yet the shape wasn't anything I recognized. I crouched beside one, pressing my own boot next to it for comparison. My footprint looked small in comparison, like a child's next to an adult's. But the worst part? Whatever had left these hadn't walked away. The prints ended right outside my tent, as if the thing had stood there, watching, and then just vanished. No more tracks, no sign of retreat. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Maybe I had imagined last night. Maybe it had just been a dream. But the marks in the dirt were real, undeniably real. Something had been here, and it had been watching me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to pack up my gear and get out of this place immediately. But something held me back. Curiosity? Stubbornness? Stupidity? I didn't know. Instead, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the footprints were just oddly shaped animal tracks. Maybe the ground had shifted overnight, warping them. Maybe dash. I shook my head. It didn't matter. I needed to keep moving. After a quick breakfast, I packed up my tent and slung my backpack over my shoulders. The unease hadn't left me, but I forced myself to focus on the plan. I had come here to hike, to explore. I wasn't going to let a little paranoia send me running home. So I kept walking. But as I followed the trail deeper into the forest, the feeling of being watched never went away. By midday, the unease hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown worse. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. An almost tangible sense of being watched. The trees here looked different. I couldn't explain why, but something about them seemed off. The way they leaned ever so slightly, as if bending toward the path. The way they twisted branches and knotted together, forming strange, jagged shapes against the grey sky. It felt like I was being funneled somewhere. And then I found it. An old, abandoned cabin, half hidden behind a cluster of dense brush. It looked ancient, its wooden walls warped and darkened with age, the roof partially collapsed under years of neglect. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of recent activity. And yet, despite its state of ruin, it felt occupied. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, every instinct in me screaming to turn around. But curiosity pulled me forward. I stepped onto the creaking wooden porch. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. Something had scratched into the wood near the entrance, deep gouges like claw marks. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. Dust floated in the weak shafts of light, filtering through the broken windows. The furniture, if it could still be called that, was half decayed. Skeletal remains of chairs and a table that had long since given into time. But it was the walls that made my stomach drop. Carved into the wood, hundreds of strange symbols. Some were sharp and angular, others curved and looping, forming patterns that made no sense. They covered every surface, overlapping in places like someone had spent years scratching them in. I stepped closer, running my fingers along one of the carvings. It felt warm, like the wood had been burned recently, even though there was no soot, no ash. Then I saw something worse. In the far corner of the cabin, partially buried beneath a collapsed beam, was a pile of bones. At first, I told myself they were animal remains, but among them, gleaming in the dim light, a human skull. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes locked onto the skull, half buried beneath the pile of decayed bones and debris. It was old, its once white surface now yellowed and cracked. The empty eye sockets stared blankly, as if frozen in an expression of silent warning. For a long moment, I just stood there, unable to move, unable to think. Then, a single horrifying thought cut through my paralysis. I shouldn't be here. I backed away, my foot hitting a loose floorboard with a sharp creak. The sound echoed through the dead silence of the cabin, and for the first time, I became aware of just how quiet it was outside. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating, unnatural stillness. I forced myself to breathe, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe the skull was old. Maybe this had been a hunter's cabin, and the bones were from some poor animal. A grim, but not entirely unusual sight. But I knew better. I looked at the symbols carved into the walls again, their jagged lines seeming deeper now, almost as if they were pulsing. I had seen enough. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened here, I wanted no part of it. I turned on my heel and hurried out, stepping back onto the rotting porch, my boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The air outside was cooler, but the moment I stepped away from the cabin, I felt watched. Not the vague unease I'd felt before. This was different. It was an overwhelming, suffocating presence, pressing in on me from all sides. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I needed to leave. I adjusted my backpack, forcing my legs to move, my steps quick and unsteady as I made my way back to the trail. I wasn't running, but I wasn't far from it. Then, just as I was about to disappear back into the tree line, I heard it. A murmur, low, distant, coming from inside the cabin. It sounded like whispering. I didn't look back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to keep my steps measured, controlled. Because deep down, I knew if I ran, it would chase me. The whispering continued, faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the creaking of old wood settling. It was deliberate. A voice, low, murmuring, just beneath the threshold of understanding. I clenched my fists and kept walking. The further I got from the cabin, the weaker the sound became. But the feeling of being watched never left. By the time I reached the main trail, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. My hands shook as I adjusted the straps on my backpack. I glanced back once. The cabin was barely visible through the dense trees, just a dark shape against the fading light. But for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement in the doorway. A shadow, tall, still, watching. I didn't wait to see if it would step out. I turned and kept walking. An unsettling night. By the time I found another place to set up camp, the sun had dipped below the trees, leaving the forest bathed in dim, shifting shadows. I chose a small clearing near a rocky outcrop, far from the cabin, far from whatever had been inside it. I told myself I was safe here. I built a fire, watching as the flames flickered bright and strong, pushing back the growing darkness. The warmth should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a beacon, that something out there could see me just as clearly as I could see the fire. I ate my dinner in silence, every bite feeling like sandpaper against my dry throat. Then, for the second time that day, I felt it. The woods were too quiet. No insects, no birds, not even the distant rustling of a breeze. Just a deep, oppressive silence. I held my breath, and then, crunch. A footstep, somewhere beyond the firelight. I whipped my head around, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the underbrush. And for just a split second, I saw something move. Something pale. Too tall, too thin, and then it was gone. The silence stretched. The air felt thicker, heavier. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sounds of the forest returned. A distant owl hooting, the soft chirp of crickets, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Something was out there. Something had found me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined it. That pale shape lurking beyond the firelight, waiting for me to let my guard down. My heart pounded relentlessly in my chest. Every shadow stretching too far, every flickering ember in the fire making me think something was moving just out of sight. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. But something was wrong. The fire had burned low, casting only faint, glowing embers. But that wasn't what woke me. It was the sound. A rhythmic, low breathing. Not mine. I froze. My fingers tightened around my flashlight, barely daring to move. The sound was close, somewhere to my right, just outside the glow of the dying fire. I clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes empty. Hollow, black pits that reflected my flashlight like glass. Then, it moved. Not in the way a person would move. Jerkier, more unnatural. Like a puppet on invisible strings. I scrambled backward, my body acting before my mind could process what I had just seen. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. But by the time I blinked, the thing was gone. The underbrush where it had stood was still swaying, as if something had just passed through it. I swung the flashlight wildly, scanning the trees, the rocks, the shadows. Nothing. Nothing but the soft whisper of the wind and the flicker of dying embers. My hands were shaking. I didn't sleep again after that. I just sat there, my knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, staring into the dark, waiting for it to come back. The night dragged on. I sat there, gripping my knife and flashlight, my back pressed against a rock, refusing to take my eyes off the trees. Every so often, I'd hear something shifting in the distance, the snap of a twig, the rustle of underbrush, but it never came closer. It was toying with me, letting me know it was still out there. By the time the first traces of dawn broke through the canopy, I was exhausted, my limbs sore from staying tense all night. But despite the overwhelming need for rest, I didn't dare close my eyes. I needed to move. With trembling fingers, I packed up my camp, constantly checking my surroundings, convinced that at any moment I'd see it again. As I strapped my backpack on, I noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. Footprints, right at the edge of my camp. But they weren't normal. They were long, narrow, and deep, pressed into the soft dirt in a pattern that made no sense. No heel marks, just toes, as if something had been crawling upright. I swallowed the rising panic and forced my legs to move. I needed to get back to the truck. I needed to get out. A wrong turn. I moved fast, barely stopping to catch my breath as I pushed through the forest, retracing my steps toward where I'd left my truck. But something was wrong. The trail looked different. I had been following clear markers on my way in. Certain trees, bends in the path, a distinct fork in the road. Now, everything looked off, like the landscape had shifted overnight. I stopped, scanning the trees. This wasn't right. I reached into my backpack, pulling out my compass. The needle spun wildly for a second, then stopped, pointing in the wrong direction. I turned in place, my heartbeat accelerating. Had I made a mistake? Had I taken the wrong path in the dark? Number. That wasn't it. Something had changed. The forest was leading me somewhere else, and I was walking straight into it. I kept walking, trying to shake the sense of wrongness clawing at my brain. The trail should have been familiar, but every step took me somewhere unfamiliar. I glanced at my compass again. The needle was still pointing wrong, spinning slightly, jittering, like it couldn't decide which way was north. I swallowed hard. The rational part of my brain fought back. Maybe I was just disoriented. Maybe I had missed a marker in my rush to get out of here. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a mistake. The forest was different now. Like the trees had shifted overnight, their trunks twisting at subtle, unnatural angles. Like the sky above had grown darker. even though the sun had fully risen. Like I had stepped off the map into something else entirely. I needed to get my bearings. I stopped, resting my hands on my knees, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. I had to think, had to figure out what had gone wrong. Then, a sound, distant, muffled, like something moving through the trees. I snapped my head up, my body tensing. The sound came again, closer this time. Crunch, rustling leaves. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved with purpose, quick and skittish. This was slow, deliberate, like something was following me. My fingers curled around the knife in my pocket. I didn't dare move. Then just ahead, barely visible through the dense trees, a structure, a cabin, not the same one from before. This one was different, older. It shouldn't have been there, but it was, waiting for me. I stood frozen, staring at the cabin that shouldn't have been there. It looked even older than the first one. Its wooden walls warped, the roof half collapsed, and the door slightly open, hanging from rusted hinges. A faint breeze whispered through the trees, but it wasn't enough to move the door. Something had left it open. The forest was silent again. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own uneven breathing. I told myself to turn around, to keep moving, but I didn't, because I saw something. On the ground, right in front of the cabin, was a footprint. Not mine, and not human. The shape was wrong, too long, with elongated toe marks that dug deep into the dirt. The same kind of prints I had seen outside my tent. My stomach twisted. I had two choices: leave now or step inside. Every logical part of me screamed to walk away. But something about the cabin pulled at me, like I was meant to be here, like something inside was waiting. I took a step forward. The floorboards creaked as I stepped onto the porch. The air around me felt thicker, heavy with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. I pushed the door open a little wider. The inside was dark, only faint slivers of light cutting through the broken roof. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old tattered books and strange wooden carvings. And at the center of the room, a table. Something was on it. A notebook. Its cover was worn and cracked, the edges curling with age. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was writing scrawled across the open pages, faded but still readable. And the words, they made my blood run cold. You were not supposed to find this place. It knows you're here. Do not look for it. Do not let it see you first. My hands shook as I flipped the page. There was one last sentence written in jagged letters. If you hear it whisper, it's already too late. Then, from the dark corner of the cabin, a whisper. I froze. The whisper wasn't a voice exactly, not something I could understand. It was low, almost like a hum, shifting in pitch, rhythmic, unnatural. The sound wrapped around me, filling the small, decayed cabin, slipping into the corners of my mind like something that had always been there, waiting. I gripped the notebook tighter, my knuckles white. The whisper came again. This time, closer. I spun around. Nothing. The shadows stretched too far, pooling in places they shouldn't. I flicked my flashlight toward the far end of the cabin, illuminating the dust-choked air, but there was no one there. And then I saw it. On the wall, scratched into the rotting wood, words newer than the ones in the book, carved deep, jagged. It's watching from the trees. My stomach dropped. I turned back toward the doorway, my mind screaming at me to leave. But the whispering didn't stop. It was behind me now. Right behind me. I felt the air shift, the temperature drop, and an overwhelming sense of presence. Like something was standing there, watching, waiting. I didn't look. I couldn't. Because if I did, if I let it see me first, I knew I wouldn't leave this cabin alive. I took a shaking step toward the door, forcing my body to move slow, measured. The whispering grew louder. My heart slammed against my ribs, my entire body screaming at me to run. But I kept my pace steady, never breaking my stride, until I crossed the threshold. And then the whispering stopped, just like that, as if it had never been there. The woods were silent again. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, because I wasn't sure if I was alone anymore. I walked. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Every instinct in my body screamed that I was being followed. The forest around me was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the distant crunch of my boots on the damp earth. And something else. Something mimicking my steps. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. I gritted my teeth, my pulse hammering in my ears. This was wrong. I needed to get out. The notebook's warning replayed in my mind. Do not let it see you first. I walked faster, forcing my breathing to stay even, resisting the overwhelming urge to run. The trees around me thickened, the path narrowing. Then, a branch snapped. Close. I whipped my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating something just at the edge of the light. A figure. Tall, thin, wrong. It stood perfectly still, barely visible through the gaps in the undergrowth. Its skin was pale, stretched too tight, almost translucent. And its eyes. It had no eyes, just deep black hollows, empty and endless. The flashlight flickered. I took a shaking step backward. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. The whispering started again, low, software coming from its throat. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around my knife. This thing, it had been following me, leading me here. I had made a mistake. I hadn't found it first. It had found me. I didn't move. Neither did it. The thing stood motionless between the trees, its hollow eyes locked onto me. The whispering grew louder, vibrating in the air around me. It wasn't coming from its mouth. It was coming from everywhere. I felt it crawl up my spine, burrowing into my skull like something trying to get inside my head. I gripped my knife tighter, my legs screaming at me to run, but some deep, instinctual part of me knew that the second I turned my back, it would chase me. I took a slow, measured step backward. It tilted its head. The motion was jerky, unnatural. like it wasn't used to moving. My breath hitched. Another step, then another. It still didn't move. Maybe, just maybe, I could get away. Then it twitched. Not like a human, not like an animal, like something glitching, skipping through frames of reality, here, then closer, then closer. A deep, inhuman click sounded from its throat, and then it moved. Fast. It didn't run. It didn't even seem to touch the ground. 1 second, it was there. The next, it was closer. Too close. I didn't think. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my face, cutting my skin, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The whispering had turned into a deafening hum, filling the forest, pressing against my skull. I could hear it behind me, moving effortlessly, closing the distance. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs screaming. I had to get away. I had to. The trees blurred around me, the path twisting, warping, shifting. The forest was changing. And then, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I had run straight off a ledge. For a moment, there was only weightlessness. Then, impact. I hit the ground hard, pain exploding through my side as I tumbled down a steep slope, crashing through undergrowth, rocks, roots. By the time I came to a stop, my vision swam. The whispering was gone. The forest was silent again. But I knew it was still out there, looking for me. And now, it knew exactly where I was. I lay there, my body screaming in pain. The fall had knocked the breath out of me, leaving me gasping against the damp earth. My vision blurred, the world around me tilting as I struggled to focus. I wasn't sure how long I had been lying there, but the silence was heavy. The whispering had stopped. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Because that meant it was listening now, waiting. I pushed myself upright, biting down a groan of pain as my ribs protested. I could feel the sharp sting of scratches and bruises covering my arms, my legs. My flashlight was gone. My knife was missing. My pack had torn open in the fall, and half my supplies were scattered in the underbrush. I was hurt. I was alone. And I was being hunted. Nowhere left to run. I forced myself to move, ignoring the screaming protests of my body. The forest wasn't right anymore. The trees looked different, their trunks twisted, gnarled into shapes that made no sense. The air was thicker, pressing against me like an unseen weight. I didn't know where I was. The path was gone. I stumbled forward, one hand pressed against my aching ribs, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing, just emptiness. I walked for what felt like hours, but the trees never changed. Like I was moving in circles. Then, a sound. Not whispering, something else. A low dragging noise, something heavy being pulled across the ground. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. At first I saw nothing, just trees, shadows. Then, in the distance, a figure, tall, motionless, waiting. I took a step backward. It tilted its head, and then it started moving. Not walking, not running, just gliding. The whispering started again. Low, close, too close. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had nowhere left to run. I couldn't breathe. The figure was closer now, moving without moving, shifting through the trees like a shadow, given form. The whispering grew louder, crawling into my ears, wrapping around my thoughts like something alive. I took another step back. It tilted its head again, that same unnatural jerking motion, like it was trying to understand me. Then it did something that turned my stomach to ice. It smiled. A wide, impossibly stretched grin cutting across its pale face like a wound. I didn't think. I ran. Pain flared in my side, my ribs screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Branches whipped against my skin, thorns tore at my clothes, but I kept going, plunging deeper into the forest, hoping, praying that I could find something, anything that would get me out of this nightmare. The whispering never faded. It followed me, stalked me. It was inside the trees, inside the wind, inside me. Then I saw light. Not daylight, not the sun. Something else. A faint, flickering glow just beyond the trees. A fire. I ran toward it, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for relief. And then I burst into a clearing. The forgotten camp. I nearly collapsed, my hands on my knees as I gasped for air. The fire wasn't natural. It wasn't burning anything. Just floating, flickering in the air, casting an eerie glow over what lay in front of me. A campsite. Old, abandoned, torn tents, scattered belongings, a rusted-out backpack lying half buried in the dirt. Whoever had been here was long gone. Or worse, never left. The whispering stopped. The forest held its breath. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw them. Not just one, not just two, but several figures standing motionless, their hollow eyes locked on me. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a forest. This was a trap, and I had walked right into it. I didn't move. The figures stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the glow of the strange, flickering fire. Their bodies were still, but the whispering had started again, low, rhythmic, crawling through the air like a thing with teeth. I took a step back, my foot crunching against dead leaves. The whispering grew louder. They moved, not all at once, just a twitch, a shift in posture, like something stirring awake after a long sleep. I glanced at the campsite, searching for anything that could explain what had happened here. The tents were ripped open, as if something had clawed through them. Rusted camping gear lay scattered, untouched by time, but covered in dust. And then I saw it. A journal, half buried in the dirt, pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I bent down, fingers trembling as I picked it up. The handwriting was messy, frantic. I flipped to the last page. Don't let them see you. If you hear the whispers, it's already too late. They don't chase you. They make you come to them. There is no way out. My stomach twisted. The whispering was all around me now, slipping under my skin, pressing against my skull. I looked back toward the figures. They were closer, standing just inside the firelight now, their hollow eyes locked onto me. And they were smiling. Wide, too wide. I dropped the journal. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I ran. The whispering followed me, curling around the trees, chasing me without moving. Branches whipped my face, thorns snagged my clothes. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The forest was shifting again. The trees weren't where they should be. The path twisted, curling in on itself like something alive. I tried to follow the moonlight, but even the sky felt wrong, like the stars were in different places than before. I had to find my truck. I had to get out. The marked tree. Then I saw something. A tree, its bark stripped away, revealing deep, jagged symbols carved into its surface. It was the same markings I had seen in the cabin. The whispering grew louder. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against the rough wood. It was warm, like it had been burned recently. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of wrongness surged through me. My vision blurred. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, like the ground had shifted under me. Then, footsteps. Close. I turned too fast, my head spinning. The figures were there, standing between the trees, watching me. They weren't smiling anymore. I stumbled back, my breathing ragged. The whispering turned into a hum, vibrating in my bones. And then I heard something worse. Another voice, behind me, too close, right next to my ear. A voice that wasn't a whisper. A voice that knew my name. Why did you come back? I froze. That voice, it shouldn't have known my name. I didn't turn around. Every instinct in my body screamed not to. The whispering figures were still ahead of me. But this voice, this thing, was now behind me. I felt the breath of something unnatural against my skin. You shouldn't have come back. The words weren't human. They weren't spoken. They were inside my head. I clenched my fists, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I had two choices. Turn around. Run. I chose the only option that made sense. I ran. The endless path. I sprinted into the darkness, not caring where the path led, just that it led away. The whispering turned into laughter, low, hollow, mocking. The trees blurred past me, their branches twisting, reaching. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, like it wasn't solid anymore, like I was running on something that wasn't earth. I tripped, fell hard. Pain shot through my hands and knees, but I scrambled back up, chest heaving, lungs burning. I wasn't where I had been. The forest had changed again. The trees were taller now, their trunks impossibly thin. The sky was gone. Just blackness overhead. No stars, no moon, just an empty void. And ahead of me, a cabin. Not the first one. Not the second one. A new one. A cabin that shouldn't be here. The door was open, waiting. A single word scratched into the wood above it. Home. And behind me, The whispering returned, closer. I was out of time. I had nowhere else to go. The whispering behind me was getting louder, pressing against my skull, wrapping around my thoughts like something alive. The cabin door stood open, waiting. A choice: run into the unknown, or turn around and face whatever was behind me. I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the whispering stopped. Inside the cabin, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of rotting wood and dust. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing was there. No latch, no lock. Just a bare wooden door that somehow closed on its own. The room was small, lined with bookshelves filled with rotting journals, strange symbols carved into the wood. In the center, a table, and on it, a mirror. My stomach twisted because the reflection wasn't mine. I stepped closer. The figure in the mirror looked like me. Same clothes, same face. But its eyes were wrong. Black, hollow. And then it smiled. Not at me. Behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I had to. My breath caught in my throat. Because standing inside the cabin now, just feet away, was one of them. I couldn't move. The figure in the mirror still smiled. Its black, hollow eyes locked onto mine. And behind me, the real thing, standing just a few feet away, not breathing, not blinking, just watching. I forced myself to turn, every nerve in my body screaming not to. And there it was, tall, too thin, pale, stretched skin. Its head tilted slightly, the way a person might look at something curious. And then it moved, not walking, not shifting. It just glitched. 1 second, it was across the room. The next, it was closer. My knees buckled, my back slamming against the mirror as I tried to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The whispering started again. Software inside my head. I clenched my fists, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Why did you come here? The voice wasn't spoken aloud. It wasn't human. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, the cabin was different. The place that wasn't real. The walls were wrong now. The wood was no longer rotting, no longer covered in dust and decay. Everything looked new, fresh, like it had never been abandoned. But that was impossible. I turned in slow motion, my heart in my throat. The thing was gone. Instead, there was a chair in the center of the room, and sitting in it was me. I staggered back. Not my reflection, not a trick of the light. It was me. Same face, same clothes, same injuries. It just smiled, and then, in my own voice, it whispered, "You were never supposed to leave." I stared at myself, sitting in that chair, looking at me with my own face. But it wasn't me. Not really. The smile was too wide. The eyes, too dark. Something inside me snapped. I took a step back, shaking my head, trying to force my brain to understand what I was seeing. "No," I whispered. The other me tilted its head, That same unnatural, jerky movement I had seen in them before. You feel it, don't you? The voice was mine, but not. Office distorted. This place is inside you now. I shook my head harder this time. You're not real. The thing in the chair just smiled. And then it stood. I stepped back again, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. You don't leave this place. I turned to run, but the door was gone. No exit. I spun, my pulse thundering in my ears. The cabin walls were closing in, the wood shifting, twisting, breathing. The air grew thicker, pressing against my skin like something alive. You were never supposed to leave, my own voice whispered again. I slammed my fists against the wall, trying to find a way out. But there was nothing, just wood, endless wood. The whispering grew louder, and behind me, the other me was getting closer. I pressed my back against the wall, chest heaving, hands shaking. Let me go, I whispered. The thing wearing my face just smiled wider. You don't leave. It took another step forward. I felt something cold press against my spine. I turned dash. A door. One that hadn't been there before. I didn't think. I shoved it open and fell through. I fell forward, expecting to hit wooden floorboards. But there was nothing beneath me. For a split second, I was weightless. Then, I slammed into the ground, pain exploding through my body as I rolled across damp earth and dead leaves. The air was cold, different. I gasped, forcing myself upright, my limbs trembling from shock and exhaustion. I wasn't in the cabin anymore. I was back in the forest. But something was wrong. The changed forest. The trees were too tall, too twisted, their branches curling into unnatural shapes. The sky was too dark, like the sun had been erased. The air was heavy, thick with a scent that made my stomach twist. Something like rotting leaves and damp wood, but underneath it, something worse. I turned, looking for the door I had come through. But it was gone. Just solid trees. No cabin. No path, nothing. I wasn't back where I had started. I was somewhere else. Somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. And then, the whispering returned. Software closer than ever. I wasn't alone. I started moving. I didn't know which direction. Didn't care. I just had to keep walking. Had to get out. The footsteps that weren't mine. The forest stretched endlessly, twisting in ways that made no sense. The trees weren't natural anymore. They were watching me. I could feel it. Every time I stopped, the air grew colder. Every time I moved, I heard footsteps behind me. Not mine, something else. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because if I did, I knew I would see it. And if I saw it first, then it would let me go. But if it saw me first, I would never leave. I kept walking. The footsteps behind me never stopped. Slow, steady, matching my pace. I didn't run, didn't turn around. I couldn't, because I knew the rule now. If I saw it first, I might escape. If it saw me first, I wouldn't. The whispering curled around me, wrapping around my thoughts like a thing with hands. It wasn't words, not exactly, just sounds, shifting in ways that didn't belong in this world. I walked faster. The trees pressed in closer, the branches curling toward me, the path growing narrower. I had no idea where I was going, but stopping wasn't an option. The clearing. Then, the forest opened up. A clearing stretched in front of me, bathed in the dim, unnatural glow of a moon that wasn't there. In the center, half buried in the dirt, a door, wooden, old, standing alone. I stopped. So did the footsteps. The whispering faded. The air shifted. I wasn't supposed to be here, but I had found it. A way out. Maybe. Or maybe this was just another trap. I stared at the door, my breath shallow. I had two choices. Step through, or stay in this place forever. Behind me, the whispering started again. Low, hungry, getting closer. I had to decide. Now, the door stood there, impossibly out of place. No walls, no frame, just wood and darkness. I didn't know where it led. Didn't know if it was a way out or something much, much worse. But behind me, the whispering was getting closer. I felt it crawling along my spine, wrapping around me like invisible hands. Something was there, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay here. I reached for the doorknob. The threshold. The metal was cold, too cold. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around it. For a split second, the whispering stopped. Like whatever was behind me was waiting to see what I would do. I turned the handle. The door swung open, and beyond it, nothing. Just a void of endless black. Wind rushed past me, pulling at my clothes, my skin, like the emptiness itself was breathing. I hesitated. I didn't want to step forward, but I couldn't turn back. Something touched my shoulder. A light, barely there pressure. Not a hand, something else. I jumped forward into the darkness. The whispering screamed, and then everything was gone. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, no ground beneath my feet. I was falling. Or maybe I wasn't. Maybe I was just floating in place, weightless in the endless black, my body no longer my own. The whispering was gone, but something else was here. Watching, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The same way you feel the air shift before a storm. The way your skin prickles when someone stands too close. I tried to move. Nothing happened. My limbs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The voices in the dark. Then, a sound. Not whispering, something worse. Voices, not one, many. They came from all around me, overlapping, distant and close at the same time. He shouldn't be here. He opened the door. What do we do with him? The air grew heavy, thick, suffocating. I struggled to breathe. Then one of the voices spoke alone. Louder, clearer. Let him go. The others fell silent. And just like that, I dropped. I fell. The void ripped away. And suddenly there was air again. Cold, sharp, real. Then, impact. I hit the ground hard, rolling over damp leaves and jagged rocks. Pain exploded through my side, knocking the breath from my lungs. I coughed, gasping, my fingers clawing at the earth to stop myself from sliding further. I was back in the forest, the same one I had been running from. But something was different. The trees looked normal now. The sky was visible, grey and overcast, but real. The air felt right, like the world had finally snapped back into place. For the first time in hours, maybe days, I heard birds. A light breeze rustled the leaves. The whispering was gone. The path back. I pushed myself upright, my limbs trembling from exhaustion. I was bruised, bloody, but alive. And then, through the trees, I saw something that nearly made me collapse. A road. Not a trail. A real paved road. And parked just a few hundred feet away. My truck. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stared, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Then my body took over. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging, my breath coming in shaky gasps. The closer I got, the more real it all felt. The keys were still in my pocket. The truck was untouched, like I had never left, like none of it had ever happened. I yanked the door open, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste another second. I hit the gas, tires kicking up dirt, the trees blurring as I sped away from that place. And I never looked back. The road stretched ahead of me, winding through the dense forest like a lifeline. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my knuckles white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The truck's headlights cut through the early morning mist, illuminating the damp pavement, but I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just trees, just the empty road. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling, like something had followed me, like something was still watching. The first sign. 15 minutes passed, 20. The forest began to thin, replaced by scattered houses, power lines, the first signs of civilization. I should have felt safe. But then, the radio turned on. I hadn't touched it. There was no station, just static. Then, through the crackling hum, a voice, software whispering, familiar. You shouldn't have left. My stomach dropped. The whispering hadn't stopped. It had just followed me. I jerked the wheel, my heart hammering as the static-filled whispering crackled through the radio. The truck veered, tires screeching as I fought to keep it on the road. You shouldn't have left. The voice was clearer now, not distant, close, like it was inside the truck. I reached for the dial, my fingers fumbling as I twisted it, trying to turn it off. The knob spun freely. The static only got louder. You opened the door. I slammed my fist against the dashboard. The radio cut off. Silence filled the truck. Just the roar of the engine, the rhythm of my ragged breathing. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I tightened my grip on the wheel. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe dash. Then, from the back seat, a soft, shuddering breath. Not mine. My whole body went cold. I was not alone. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Because deep down, I already knew what I'd see. A reflection, sitting in the back seat, smiling, waiting. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Because if I did, it would be real. The air in the truck felt wrong, heavier, like it was pressing against my skin. A soft, shuddering breath came from the back seat again. Slow, deliberate, like whoever, whatever, was back there wanted me to know it was there. The whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from inside the truck, right behind me. You brought it back with you. My hands clenched the wheel, my knuckles white. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But I had to. I had to get out. I pressed my foot hard on the gas, forcing the truck to lurch forward, the road blurring beneath me as the engine roared. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder. It was laughing now. I had to look. I had to see. Slowly, shaking, I flicked my eyes toward the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw it. Me, sitting in the back seat, smiling. But its eyes were gone. Just black, hollow pits staring at me through the mirror. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded, tires screeching, my body slamming into the wheel. I gasped, head spinning. And then, silence. I turned. The back seat was empty. But the whispering? It hadn't gone away. It had just moved somewhere else. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The back seat was empty. But the whispering hadn't stopped. It was just somewhere else now. I pressed a shaking hand to my forehead, trying to force my thoughts to make sense. Had it been real? Had I actually seen myself back there? Or was it just... No, but I wasn't going to convince myself this was all in my head. Because deep down, I knew the truth. Something had followed me out of that forest, and it wasn't done with me yet. Back to town. I put the truck in drive and hit the gas, forcing myself to focus on the road. I needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere with people. It took me another 30 minutes before I saw the first signs of town. Street lights, gas stations, the glow of neon signs cutting through the fog. I pulled into the first motel parking lot I could find. The lot was mostly empty, just a few cars. I killed the engine, my hands still trembling as I reached for the door handle. And then, the whispering came back, not inside the truck, not from the radio, but from outside. From the trees lining the parking lot. It had followed me here. The whispering slipped through the air, threading itself between the trees, wrapping around me like a thing alive. I stared at the darkened tree line beyond the motel parking lot, my body frozen in place. It had followed me. I hadn't escaped. I had just brought it somewhere new. I forced myself to move, yanking the truck door open and stumbling out. The pavement felt solid beneath me, real. But everything else, the air was too still, The motel lights buzzed too loud, like the world was holding its breath. Checking in. I pushed into the lobby, the door jingling as I entered. The receptionist, a tired-looking man in his 50s, barely glanced up from his newspaper. Need a room? My voice felt foreign when I spoke. Yeah, just for the night. He slid a key across the counter, nodding toward the hallway. Room 12. I reached for the key, and then I hesitated because something was wrong. The whispering had stopped, but not because it was gone, because it was inside now, somewhere in this motel, waiting for me. I swallowed hard and took the key. I had nowhere else to go. The hallway stretched too long, longer than it should have. The overhead lights buzzed, flickering slightly, casting warped shadows along the faded carpet. I gripped the key tightly, my pulse still hammering in my ears as I counted the doors. 9, 10, 11, then 12. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the doorknob. The whispering had been silent since I stepped inside, but that didn't mean it was gone. I slid the key into the lock, turned it. The door clicked open. The room that was waiting for me. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old furniture and something faintly rotting. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting a weak glow over the bed, the desk, the small window overlooking the parking lot. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. Then I checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. I was alone. At least, that's what I told myself. I tossed my bag onto the chair, running a hand through my hair, trying to push down the weight of exhaustion and fear. I just needed to rest, to think. But then, a knock at the door, software rhythmic, 3 taps. I froze. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice, my voice. Let me in. I didn't move. The room felt too small now, the air too thick. The knock came again. 3 slow taps, and then my own voice. Let me in. I stared at the door, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I took a step back. The voice laughed, software mocking. You left the door open once. You can do it again. I swallowed, my mouth dry. I hadn't opened the door before. I had just walked through it, and that had been enough. No escape. I turned toward the window, my pulse pounding. Maybe I could get out, but the moment I looked outside, my stomach dropped. The parking lot was gone. The truck, the road, everything outside the window was just forest. The same twisted, endless trees I had tried to escape. The whispering returned, but now it was inside the room. Behind me, I clenched my fists, my entire body locked in place, because I knew if I turned around now, I wouldn't see the motel room anymore. I would see them, waiting, watching, and if they saw me first, I wouldn't be me anymore. I couldn't move. The whispering was inside the room now, not outside the door, not beyond the window. Here, right behind me, I clenched my fists, trying to control my breathing. I knew the rule. Don't look. If I didn't turn around, maybe, just maybe, I could still leave. But then, the bathroom mirror moved. I saw it. Not directly. Just out of the corner of my eye. I wasn't alone. The reflection that wasn't mine. Slowly, I turned my head. Just enough to see the mirror. Not enough to see them. And my reflection was wrong. It looked like me, but it wasn't moving right. Its chest didn't rise when I breathed. Its head tipped too far, like the bones inside were bending wrong. And then it grinned, not at me, behind me, and it spoke in my own voice. It's your turn now. I felt the air shift. Something touched my shoulder. Cold fingers. Too many of them. I slammed my eyes shut because I knew if I looked in the mirror again, I wouldn't see myself. I would see what had taken my place. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my body to stay still. The fingers on my shoulder were cold, pressing into my skin with an unnatural stillness. The whispering grew louder, wrapping around me, filling the room, filling my head. It's your turn now. My reflection's voice. But it wasn't me. I knew what was happening. This was a trade. It had been waiting for someone, waiting for me. If I opened my eyes, if I looked again, I would take its place, and it would take mine. I couldn't let that happen. The choice. The fingers on my shoulder tightened. The whispering pushed into my skull. 100 voices, layered, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I felt the air shift, the thing in the mirror leaning forward, pressing against reality, trying to pull me in. My instincts screamed at me to move, to fight. But I couldn't fight this. I could only leave. I took a deep breath, and then I lunged forward, straight into the wall. My shoulder hit hard, the impact jarring me, snapping something loose inside my head. The room shattered. The whispering turned into a scream, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere new. No motel room, no whispering, just silence. I lay on my back, staring up at a sky I didn't recognize. Dark, but not night. Clouds moved too fast, shifting in unnatural patterns, like they weren't really clouds at all. The air was thick, pressing against my skin. I sat up, my limbs aching. I was in a clearing, not the forest I had escaped from, not the world I had known. Somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The path that led nowhere. I turned in a slow circle. No trees, no buildings, just emptiness stretching in all directions. And then a path, a single dirt road winding into the distance. I didn't know where it led, but I knew one thing. I had no other choice. So I started walking. And behind me, the whispering began again. Software distant, but closer than before. Like something had been waiting for me to wake up. Like I was still being followed. And maybe I always had been. I walked. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead of me, cutting through the emptiness like a scar. I had no idea where it led, or if it even led anywhere. But I couldn't stop, because behind me, the whispering was getting closer. A sign of something worse. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes, hours. Time didn't feel right here. But then finally, a signpost, standing crooked at the edge of the path. The wood was rotting, the letters carved deep into its surface. I stepped closer, brushed away the dirt, and read the words, "Welcome home." My stomach dropped. I had seen those words before, above the door in the clearing, the one that had led me here. The whispering returns. The air shifted. The ground felt unsteady, like I was standing on something that wasn't really solid. And the whispering, it wasn't distant anymore. It was right behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. Slowly, I turned, and standing there at the edge of the road was me. I froze. The other me stood at the edge of the road, motionless, staring. Same face, same clothes, but its eyes, black, hollow, empty. The whispering swelled, no longer coming from behind me, but from inside my own head. I staggered back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "You never left," it said. My own voice, distorted, wrong. I shook my head. Number I got out. The thing that looked like me smiled. Too wide, too unnatural. "Did you?" The words twisted in my skull, pressing into my thoughts, into the cracks of my mind. I clenched my fists. I couldn't let it in. I had to get out. But where was I supposed to go? There was only the road and the thing wearing my face. It took a step forward, and then another. The whispering grew deafening. I ran. The dirt road stretched endlessly, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. Behind me, the whispering rose into a chorus, layered voices pressing against my mind. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because I knew. If I saw it again, if I let it catch me, I wouldn't be me anymore. A choice I never wanted. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But then, the road split. Two paths stretching into opposite directions. No signs, no markings. Just a choice. Behind me, the whispering changed. Not words, laughter, mocking. Because it knew, no matter which way I ran, I was already trapped. I had never escaped at all. I stood at the fork, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body screaming for rest. Two paths, no signs, no way to know which was right. Behind me, the whispering grew louder. I had to choose. I picked the left path and ran. The forest that wouldn't let me leave. The road twisted and turned, the trees on either side pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. I ran until my legs burned, until I thought my lungs would burst. Then I saw something up ahead, a signpost. I felt a flicker of hope, until I saw what it said, "Welcome home." I skidded to a stop, my stomach twisting. I had been here before. This was the same fork in the road. The same place I had just left. I had been running in circles. The whispering turned into laughter because it knew there was no way out. I wasn't just lost. I was never supposed to leave. I stared at the sign, "Welcome home." The words felt wrong, like they had been waiting for me to return, like I had never left at all. The laughter in the whispering twisted, growing distorted. I felt something shift in the air, like the very fabric of the world was pressing against me. I had been running in circles, not because I was lost, because it had been leading me back. The voices of the taken. I clenched my fists, my breath ragged. I couldn't run, I couldn't escape. Then the whispering changed. The voices merged, overlapping into something that almost sounded human. Familiar. Recognizable. "You should have never come here." I knew that voice, my own, and it was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because I knew if I looked, if I met its eyes, that would be it. I would be the one left behind. I forced myself to move forward, stepping past the signpost, past the place where the road had looped me back. And for the first time, I didn't run. I walked, steady, measured, like I wasn't afraid, like I belonged here. The whispering didn't stop, but it didn't grow louder either. It was waiting. The final step. The road began to change. The trees stretched higher, their branches curling together into an arch. The sky shifted, colors bleeding together in a way that didn't make sense. And then I saw it. A door, standing alone, just like before. But this time, there was something carved into it. "Go back." I took a breath, reached for the handle. The whispering swelled. I could feel the eyes of the forest on me, waiting, daring me to open it. I did, and on the other side, I saw daylight. Epilogue. Did I ever leave? I woke up in my truck. The engine was off. The road stretched ahead of me. Normal. Familiar. The forest behind me was just trees. No whispering. No figures. Just silence. I checked my phone. The time was the same as when I had first entered the woods, like none of it had ever happened. But as I reached for the key, ready to start the engine, I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. There was something carved into my arm. Deep, jagged words, "Welcome home." I stared at it, my pulse hammering. And from the trees, barely audible over the wind, the whispering began again.